Hey, this is Ish, and if you've been following my channel for a while, you probably know that I'm really fascinated by people and also psychology. And one of the facets of personality that isn't emphasized as much is inhibition and its opposite, disinhibition. And today I'll be talking to you about what these terms are and what contributes to both, and some of the wisdom to both sides. And usually, people that really favor inhibition don't really support disinhibition and vice versa. But there are actually some advantages and disadvantages to both, and I'll be discussing that. So let's start by defining what these terms are. So inhibition is basically the restraint of your behavior. So it is being very mindful of how you conduct yourself in both your speech, your actions, your behaviors, your overall lifestyle. And you are monitoring or being conscious of your behavior. And on the opposite side, when we have disinhibition, this is where you're not overly monitoring yourself. You're very expressive, and it's like you don't really have a filter. You just say or do whatever you want. And I'll be talking to you a little bit more about why this is a good thing and also a bad thing. So this is lack of restraint, also impulsivity, because again, you're not really filtering, you just go after things. And you just have this attitude like, I can do or say and act how I want. And now let's go over what contributes to both. So, what contributes to inhibition? There are a lot of different factors. So, part of it is from culture, another is religion, and also certain mindfulness practices that make you more inhibited and more mindful, and also the big five personality trait of neuroticism. And I'll go over these in detail. And then if we look into disinhibition, there are certain things that also contribute to that, such as extroversion combined with low neuroticism. You also have culture as well. So certain cultures are a bit more disinhibited. And then we have testosterone and power really contributes to disinhibition as well. So I'll go over that also in detail. So let's start by going over inhibition. So the first thing I mentioned was culture. And specifically, collectivist cultures really have this strong impact on making you more inhibited. So, certain cultures, for example, I'm of Asian descent, and something you often hear often is uh, if you are thinking about an action, people say, what would your mother think, or what would your parents think, or what would society think? This is something that is um, talked about often because where you stand within a society is simply more emphasized compared to you as an individual. So you're part of something bigger. And there is beauty to that, of course, but this type of thinking and attitude also makes you a bit more conscious of how you appear. And this causes you to clamp down on your expression and how you conduct yourself. You may have also heard the term bringing shame on the family if you're part of these types of collectivist cultures. So again, your actions not only affect you but also a greater group. And there are a lot of unwritten rules in these types of cultures of how to behave. And again, you're monitoring yourself constantly and becoming very controlled. And then the next is religion and mindfulness practices. So, as you know, I'm a Buddhist nerd, and in Buddhism, actually, they emphasize a lot of inhibited practices. So, again, mindfulness is basically just that. You're becoming very aware of how you conduct yourself in your speech, of how you conduct yourself in your actions, your behavior, your lifestyle, and you're actually taking a look at that in every step of the way. And in Zen Buddhism, for example, when I go to monasteries and zendos to go practice in a more formal setting, there are just so many different rules and regulations of how I should conduct myself. So when I should bow, how I should bow, how should I hold my hands, how should I hold up my posture when I'm sitting, and every single minute is accounted for. And there's even rules on where you should look as well. So all these things make you more inhibited because you are taking your whole range of expressions and narrowing it down and monitoring yourself a lot. And of course, there's good reason for that because you're gaining in the skill of mindfulness as you do this. But just be aware that it does inhibit your behavior. And then if we go on to neuroticism, this is a trait of the Big Five personality type test. And neuroticism both comes from nature and nurture. So part of it is hereditary. So you do inherit some of that from your parents and your family of origin. And then the other part is also nurture. So your environment that you're in, if you're in a very stressful, chaotic environment where everyone's freaking out, this also contributes to that. And neuroticism is just your exposure to emotions like anxiety, depression, being very reactive. So if you're very high in this trait, this will describe you. And on the other hand, if you're very low neuroticism, you tend to be very stable, grounded, calm, and your emotions don't fluctuate as much. So being very high in neuroticism also makes you more inhibited because it clamps down on your natural expression if you're going to act in a certain way because you are overly cautious of the consequences. So people who are very neurotic can also be very inhibited because they're just really afraid of the consequences of their certain action. Now, what contributes to disinhibition? Let's talk about that. So, this is the opposite side, where instead of being very controlled, very cautious, very mindful, you are very free, loose, you say and do whatever you want. So, I've been on both sides of the spectrum from being very inhibited when I was, again, practicing a lot of meditation in Buddhist type environments, religion, but I was also very high neuroticism a little bit earlier in my life. These all contributed to a very guarded personality. And you can actually look into some of my older videos where I just seem very shy, like I'm holding back, very quiet, meek, don't want to say anything offensive. And this is where I was very high in inhibition. But I've also been in periods in my life where I was very disinhibited. I'll talk about that in a second. But what contributes to disinhibition? Well, extroversion combined with low neuroticism contributes to that because when you're extroverted, you gain energy from the outside world. You tend to be a bit louder, more expressive socially. And if this is combined with not having a filter as much, you tend to just kind of explode this energy out. You say and do whatever you want. And also, certain cultures contribute to disinhibition as well. So there are cultures that are a bit more lax in their attitudes and the way they live their life, and also topics like how to speech. They're a little bit more liberal in their speech on topics such as sex or self-expression. So these things also contribute as well. Another thing that also contributes to disinhibition is increased levels of testosterone and of power. So this is something that is talked about in the book Heroes, Rogues, and Lovers, for example, by James McBride Dabbs. This book came out, I think, over 25 years ago or so. And one thing I found very interesting is that the author sent a researcher to different fraternities to study the testosterone levels and sample the testosterone levels of fraternity members. And he found that when he took the researcher to houses that the average testosterone level was very high. He found that the members were very rambunctious. So the researcher came to a very cluttered house where people were just loud and they're just like, hey, who wants to spit in a cup? And it was kind of like a very loud, chaotic environment. And the places was a mess. People were very loud, rude, and just a little crazy, disinhibited. And on the other hand, when he sent that same researcher to houses where the average testosterone level was very low, the place was actually very orderly, and the members were all very polite. And in fact, they even called beforehand to verify the person's references, and they were very inhibited in that example. So people who are very high in testosterone tend to be disinhibited. And on the same type of line of thinking, when we think about power, power has a very strong impact on disinhibition as well. And basically, what testosterone does is it reduces your threshold for action. In addition, it also reduces fear and anxiety. And you also don't really care about what other people think. So when you combine all these things, in addition to obviously reduced empathy, is that you simply just do say whatever you want without consequence. And more powerful people tend to have higher levels of testosterone. And I'm sure you could think of a time where you had a boss who simply said and did whatever they wanted. And It was slightly a little bit on the edge, and this kind of gives you an idea of the disinhibition inhibition factor. That was a tongue twister. So now let's talk about the advantages and also disadvantages of both sides. So being very inhibited and also being very disinhibited. So when we look at inhibition, one of the advantages here is that the world can actually become a very safe place. And this is a very scalable solution for a lot of people to teach. This is why a lot of religions and cultures teach you to be inhibited, is because if everyone was inhibited, there'd be no offense in the world because people are very cautious of how they present themselves and how they conduct themselves. And this could have an added advantage too, because this is like a virtuous cycle. Because if you live in a way that doesn't really rock the boat, and you live a life of where you don't have any regrets or remorse of the consequences of your actions because you're conducting yourself in a very safe way, well, this also leads to a happier state of mind because you have no regrets and you've lived your life in a way that you don't feel bad about. So this is a very strong thing. And this is talked about in Buddhism, for example, where your conduct, known as Shila, contributes to concentration, and concentrated mind is a happy mind. But again, some of the disadvantages of that is when you're very inhibited, you can also be afraid of to go after what you want. And you also have a lack of freedom and a limited sense of expression because you are controlled and you're in this box where you can't really say or do things outside of that. So you can feel trapped, and that's one of the big disadvantages of being very inhibited that they don't really talk about as much in obviously these types of cultures or religions. You can also be controlled by shame as well, because like I mentioned, the family system or the cultural system can say, hey, your behavior reflects on the family, or you shouldn't be doing that, and control you by shame. So this is also not really good as well. The next downside to being inhibited is that you can become controllable and tame and muted. Because again, if you are told to follow these set of rules and you have to fit within this box, and if you do anything outside that box, you'll be shamed for it. Well, this is not good. You're being controlled by an outside force. And you can also encounter repression issues as well, because if you're told certain natural things are bad and you shouldn't be doing that, well, this can cause repression issues where you're repressing this energy within you. And this can manifest in a lot of different ways. Now, let's talk about disinhibition. So, one of the great positives and advantages of being very disinhibited is that you experience a lot of freedom and authenticity. So you want to ask yourself, how would you live if you weren't afraid of the judgments of others? And this is what disinhibited people do. They just act how they want. And some people really live their lives without any filters or minimal filters. And yeah, sure, there is a downside to that, but there's also some wisdom to that because kids actually act like that. They say and do whatever they want, and they don't fear the consequences. And they're just really free. They're free to act and how they want and say they're just really being themselves. And you can get in touch with that by asking yourself, what was I really like before society told me to shut up or to not express myself, or the culture that I'm living in? And you become free. You kind of get back in touch with that. And you can be pleasantly surprised on how free your life gets. And when you really be yourself, it just feels so good to be yourself. I don't know how else to explain it. And the next great advantage of being disinhibited is, weirdly enough, leadership. So, as humans, we unconsciously look for those that are simply free, like I mentioned. And this is actually a sign of leadership because it shows that you aren't what we call socially pinging off other people or that you're reactive to other people. So, people that are seen as leaders set their own vision or act how they want, and they aren't looking for group consensus or what the group thinks because they are the one setting the tone and other people follow or react to them. So disinhibition is actually a sign of leadership because you aren't constrained. So you can think of it like how a CEO, for example, in a company would act. And very corporate companies are actually very good examples of inhibition because in these environments, you're told how to act or how to behave, and you have to maintain a certain professional decorum, for example. And you'll notice a lot of the newer employees will act in very controlled ways, and they're very afraid of how they're coming across. But the CEOs, for example, can do something a little bit on the edge or a bit risky, for example, like curse in a meeting out loud. And they can get away with it. No one actually bats an eyelid if they do it. But an intern, for example, would not be able to do that in a board meeting. So that is an example of that. And being disinhibited actually shows that you are a leader and you can get away with it. So it does actually imply power or leadership because you were able to get away with it, those behaviors. So, what are the disadvantages of being very disinhibited? That's a tongue twister again. Well, there's some very obvious ones, like you tend to be impulsive or reckless. You have no forward thinking of the consequences of your actions because, again, you're not really mindful. You just act and do whatever you want. And this can have some very strong negative effects in your life. And coming back to this example that I've talked about, how people who are in power or in leadership positions tend to be a bit more disinhibited. Well, you can also see their fall as well, where as they gain more in power, they lose their empathy, their critical thinking skills. And I'm sure you've seen many examples where people fell for their own hubris. It's called the hubris syndrome, where they thought they were untouchable or entitled, and they acted in ways that were completely reckless and had no thought for the consequences. They just thought they could get away with it also. And as a result of this, they actually met their own doom or failure because it caught up to them in the end. So that's the very strong disadvantage of being very high in disinhibition. In addition, you can also cause harm in your relationships as well, because if you're just blurting things out that may be offensive, but a person takes it in the wrong light, well, you can also cause harm as well. So there is a line you want to walk because, again, you want to be free to express yourself in a way, but you don't want to be offensive to others. You don't want to cause harm to others. You don't want to make people uncomfortable. So you also want to be mindful of how your actions, your behaviors, how you talk to others have an impact on your world because it does. So I think there is a way to balance both. And what I've personally noticed, and this could be just my bias, is that people who hang around in a lot of very inhibited circles, like very corporate environments or certain religious environments or cultural environments that really emphasize inhibition a lot, tend not to like disinhibited behaviors. And people who are very free and they just do whatever I want, disinhibited, tend to also look down on inhibited behaviors. But I really think you can do both, and you can have the freedom to say something just a little bit controversial, a little risque, to be free, be like a kid, say do whatever you want. But then you can also be mindful of how you're conducting yourself, how things are affecting others, and also conduct yourself in a way that you don't have regrets over the actions you've caused as well. So I think there is a fine line. You can do both. But again, I hope you like this talk on inhibition and disinhibition. And let me know your thoughts about this in the comments. Thank you.